Studio B presents The Origin. Written by Randall J. Bell and Gabriel Burkum. Read by Randall J. Bell. Guitar performed by Chris Schoenberg, with recording and sound design by Patrick Musilek at Studio B in Omaha, Nebraska. This program is copyright 2018 by Randall J. Bell.
The Origin. Prologue. It is the year of our Lord, 1162. Silence consumes the black air of these midnight hours. The moon's glow finds its resting place across the scape of a small, humble village. A delicate breeze tickles the leaves in a nearby orchard, filling the atmosphere with the sweet smell of amber fruits. A family of black crickets sing to the stars, all rest in golden slumbers. On the edge of town, the body of a blacksmith lies on the rickety wooden floor of his meager abode, still and lifeless. Hovering, poised above his still warm corpse, towers a large black wolf, teeth bared and dripping red. The blacksmith's widow is guarded by their only son, the young boy's feet planted firmly in the corner of the house, his legs and arms spread wide, shielding her from the fierce rabid creature. The wolf's yellow eyes pierce through the darkness like a warrior's saber, paralyzing his helpless prey. His black head lowers and his shoulders tighten. The wooden floor creaks as razor-sharp claws dig deep into the grain. His growl rumbles like a volcano. Suddenly, the beast makes a move, pouncing toward its victims. From the darkness, a second young boy screams as he flies through the doorway, wielding a heavy scythe, pinning the wolf's head to the floorboards with a scarlet crunch. The beast gurgles as thick, hot blood pours from its gaping mandible, and death rattles in its bones. The young boy stammers to his feet and presses the scythe deeper into the animal's skull. The woman faints into the corner of the dwelling, and the two young boys carry her to bed, covering her in a thick blanket made of sheep's wool. Previously, the young boys only knew each other from working in the fields with their families during harvest. On this night, an unbreakable bond was forged, one that would last forever. Two fates woven together in the fabric of time. The blacksmith's son, Zoricus, forever indebted to his new brother Fendrel, the son of an apple farmer. Act 1. Fendrel and Zoricus. 30 summers and 30 winters pass. The nights have grown longer and darker. A bleak disturbance hovers over the land, choking all that draws breath, blotting out the light and the warmth of the sun. One particular terror resides over the village in the form of shadows and teeth. Nightfall finds bolted doors and repeated prayers chanted at bedside. Occurrences of kidnapping and the mutilation of livestock in fields have become commonplace. At nightfall, fear swims through the streets. What was once legend, nightmare, and myth has become realized in a horrible physical form. Commoners seek refuge in the power of the church and find comfort in the strength of their own champions. Despite the grim absolution of their predicament, whether through faith or through brawn, there is still hope to be found, as mankind still fosters benevolence and righteousness. This is where our story begins. Zoricus and Fendrel remain close. Widely respected as high priest in the Church of our Lord, Zoricus has dedicated his life to the service of one true God and to his people. Fendrel, a widower, spends his days toiling in the fields of his late father's land alongside his beautiful daughter, Isabella. Both men have become regarded as respected pillars of the community. On one particularly quiet and peaceful night, all were asleep when an eerie hum resounded from the mountains to the north. Branches sway and whine as their leaves serenade and chatter in the icy gusts of wind. Between the windows and under the door frames, a draft coos and softly whistles, a spine-tingling cacophony, resonating down to the very soul of every little ear. In the distance, shadows devour the landscape with the gnashing of fanged teeth. The earth shakes at the tremble of countless hoofbeats reverberating from higher ground, the anthem of doom. Closer and closer, this dark cavalry tramples the black soil as it nears the village. At the helm rides a mountain of a man, cloaked in black fur and adorned in despair, his face obscured by a mask of chiseled bone. Under his command, blood flows as livestock are brought to slaughter and homes crumble into piles of fiery debris. Black soot and ash dance and glide through the hot air. From his clenched, outstretched fist, mayhem is born. Land that previously bathed in the soft glow of the moon now flails, drowning in the blood and tears of its inhabitants. All around, townsfolk awaken to pandemonium and chaos. Cries for mercy echo and resound through the streets as the shadowy Congress, shrouded in pitch darkness, ravage their countryside and raid their homes without so much as an utterance of elucidation. Half-dressed, half-awake men hysterically bound through the streets with clubs and knives and axes, clumsily swinging into the shadows. The women lock the doors and frantically barricade every possible entry of their homes. Isabella, Fendrel's daughter, nervously shakes her father awake. "Father, wake up," she whispers feverishly. His eyes burst open as he leaps out of bed and stammers to the windowsill. Fendrel's groggy vision slowly focuses onto the horrors that befall his village below. In a fumbling panic, he quickly rushes to the pantry and whips the wicker mat from the floor, then kneels down and inserts 2 fingers through a pair of small holes in the wooden boards. He winces as he struggles to pull upward. Nails creak as they are pried from the floor beams, and his muscles tremor. Moments later, a small crawl space is revealed beneath the floor. Turning to his sweet Isabella, he beckons the young girl from the window. Hesitantly, she approaches him and nervously offers her father her trembling hand. He embraces her before quickly lowering her into the dark space below. Once her feet feel the cold earth, she looks up toward him. "Father, don't leave me. Please don't leave me here," she cries. "I must go. You'll be safe here, I promise. Be silent, be still, and await my return." Fendrel throws a heavy cloak around his neck and takes up his scythe, bursting into the brisk night air. The wooden door slams and latches behind him. Guided by the only light in existence, the dim, golden-orange haze pouring from the burning village below. Fendrel finds himself racing through the grassy path of long nettles, down toward the morbid, dismal scene. Man, woman, and child alike are savagely plucked from their tranquil slumber and thrown into tribulation, a fiery hell on earth. Upon approaching the nightmare, Fendrel lunges into the bedlam with clenched fists and white knuckles. Shadows screech and burr all around him through the darkness. He only catches glimpses of the black demonic army. Through the smoke, he approaches a man who is sitting hunched over in the mud and filth, weeping onto the limp, lifeless body of a little boy, the man's son, swaddled in his arms. The man tearfully raises his face upward toward Fendrel. His voice quivers as he stutters, barely able to speak. He whimpers 3 words. "They murdered him." Fendrel's grip tightens on his weapon as he backs away slowly, studying the war-torn ambiance. A nearby burning barn collapses and crackles into a white, roaring blaze. A young calf cries out for its mother as fugitive livestock clumsily bustle and stampede through the square. The local seamstress screams hysterically as she slides and staggers through the mud toward a burning home, held back by 2 other women. Her children char and broil in their beds as their cottage dissolves into the flame. Hulking, shadowy figures swarm about. Indescribable atrocities abound. Blood-curdled screams of men echo through the valley, and the smell of iron and steel linger on the poisonous air. That which is not burning is slathered and spattered in thick, red blood. Through the violent flames, Fendrel's eyes behold the beast lord of the army. His mouth stretched wide, roaring commands of carnage and destruction toward his putrid subordinates. Cackling demons rampage through the town with a constant muddled hiss. 3 of them kneel over the carcass of a dead horse, gnawing on the belly and mane. The giant creature slowly tramples toward the dread feast. As he nears, the smaller feeders disperse and distance themselves from him with a hiss. Reaching down, the creature presses the snout into the soil and sinks his claws through the lower mandible of the deceased Mustang, prying it from the mangled corpse. Lifting it to his face, the wild man's tongue protrudes from beneath his horrid mask like a hungry serpent, slaking his thirst upon the dripping blood and marrow. Fire bubbles and consumes the horse's flesh as humid, rotten mist fills the atmosphere. It is not long before the stare of this evil menace finds the farmer. Their eyes lock, and time stands still. Fendrel's heart drops, and his vision shifts and blurs. A deafening hum shakes in Fendrel's skull. Through the flames, the giant man slowly raises his outstretched arm toward Fendrel, and in a burst, clenches his armored fist. The apple farmer drops to his knees and covers his ears as the hum grows louder and louder into a blinding buzz. Then, just as quickly as it all began, it stops. Through a thick, acrid cloud of black smoke and soot, the wild battalion vanish back into the night from whence they rode. Fendrel regains focus. As he opens his eyes, he awakens to the town in flames and rivers of blood cascading in the streets. He hears the wailing of mothers and fathers. The cry of a small child pierces and rings in his ears, reminding him of Isabella. As swiftly as his feet will carry him, he races up the cliffside to his cottage. His feet slip in the mud and stinging nettles as he tumbles through the thicket. The closer he gets, the louder his heart pounds with fear and uncertainty. He draws nearer to the cottage, and from the distance finds it to be seemingly untouched, unnoticed. As Fendrel reaches for the door, his spine tingles when his fingers discover crude hackings of an obliterated door latch. Adrenaline surges through his veins as he shoves the haggard door open and steps through the threshold into his disheveled home. "Isabella, daughter!" he screams as he rushes toward the parlor where Isabella was hidden. He drops to his knees and pulls the floorboard up. desperately swinging his arms through the darkness, searching about the crawlspace where he had left her. The floorboards had been torn asunder. His imagination soars as his eyes frantically dart about his home. Flashes of struggle burst through his mind, chilling him to the core as he tries to make sense of the disarray. Peering down into the crawlspace, he collapses to the floor. Isabella is gone. Tears stream down his leathery cheeks, and he cries out, "No!" He desperately pulls himself to the door and topples to the ground outside. "Isabella! Isabella! Isabella!" He screams until his throat is raw and bloodied. His fists beat and pound the earth beneath him until darkness forms at the edges of his vision, and he laments until his body can no longer comply. A subtle hiss whispers in his head, growing louder and louder as he loses consciousness. All is dark. All is black. Act 2, A Rainy Morning. The rooster crows. Heavy rain gushes from the gray, menacing clouds that loom above the village. Randall awakens facing the clouds as raindrops sift through the stale air, his back sunk firmly into the mud. For a short while, he remains, still, staring into the heavens. A markedly harsh breeze winds through the thicket and the bush. The front door of his cottage creaks back and forth, cracking against the shattered remains of the old doorframe. The farmer's old fingers burrow into the soft mud, and his arms press against the earth. Slowly, he rises to his feet. The showers rinse the mud from his nightgown and soak his large beard. He turns and staggers past the gate and makes his way through the muddy fields, down the cliffside, towards his village. Lightning streaks through the skies as thunder claps and rolls. "This isn't real. This can't be real. This has not happened," he mumbles to himself in a muddled daze of denial. From the distance, a quiet, chilling sound of wailing reverberates against the trees. He approaches carefully, and even though the nightmare is fresh and vivid, the weary farmer is still taken aback upon witnessing the carnage by the dim light of day. He pauses for a moment, then continues trudging through the flooding streets and the bleak devastation. Burned structures still smoldering produce a thick, wet smog that slithers and lingers like an uninvited serpent. Pairs of women struggle to push rickety wooden carts through the mud, gathering the dead and tending to the wounded. Men of God are heard reciting blessings over the bodies of the many deceased. The farmer fixes his gaze upon a great stone-carved church, the only structure left completely intact. He raises his face to the dark skies and stretches his arms toward the heavens. Icy raindrops mix with his warm tears, and his mouth hangs agape without words. Suddenly, a large hand grasps his shoulder. Randall turns around to see his old friend, Zoricus the high priest, and for a moment, both men remain silent. "She's gone. They have taken my girl," he cries. Embracing Randall, Zoricus assures, "Don't worry, old friend. We will find her." Zoricus sounds the horn for the town's leaders to come to council. The town elders congregate in the alabaster cathedral. Men who have lost their homes, their families, their livestock. Men who are driven by fierce, unbridled retribution. These are not warriors, but mere farmers and bakers, tax collectors, millers, and fishermen, joined together by one singular charge: to find and kill the creatures that desolated their town, retrieve Randall's daughter, the sweet Isabella, and pike the head of the evil master on a pig pole. Zoricus raises his staff into the air before the clan, commanding their attention. Mumbling ceases as all eyes fix upon their tall, respected elder and hang on to every word that falls from his lips. His voice echoes throughout the great hall, piercing the silence. The assembly schemes and devises a plan. After the short meeting, the men are instructed to return home to their families and have one last peaceful night before their perilous quest in the early coming hours, when, given orders to gather and produce any weapon or farm tool with a sharp, heavy edge and as much food as they can carry, they are to set out. The morning finds no more and no less than 60 devoted peasants waiting at the steps of the church, armed to the teeth with weapons, farm tools, and crude armaments. The recent invasion has rendered them horseless, forcing them to travel afoot. Zoricus raises his staff once more, calming the militia. Randall steps forward, turns, and faces the men. His words, although low in volume, speak directly to his listeners. My brothers, we have all suffered greatly. This will not be an easy quest, and we will all suffer again before it has ended. Some of you may even die, but I tell you the truth, my brothers. They will suffer more. The men roar and applaud. We will repay every single evil deed committed against us 1,000 times over. Fear will strike like a hammer as they look into our eyes, and they will know it. Know it more than their very own cursed reflection. Mercy, my brothers, does not exist. Surrender shall dangle from their lips, and we shall shove it down their wretched gullets, where it shall fester and boil in their bellies. The men cheer and make way as Zoricus and Fenrir walk forward, leading the now fearless 60 through the town streets and past the gates of civilization, toward dangers and trials unfathomed. Act 3, The Perilous Quest. The 60 exhausted and dazed men march on for 3 days and 3 nights up the steep, wild terrain. With little sleep and even less sustenance, the weary soldiers press on, despite the sweltering heat of the hottest summer in years. As the odyssey continues, the elements take their toll. The air grows thinner and thinner. The gusts of dusty wind parch their throats and dry their eyes. Water is scarce. By nightfall, on just the 3rd day of travel, the clan finds their numbers have dwindled and have lessened by 10. 10 soldiers, 10 good men, have all but satisfied the appetite of the cruel and unforgiving sun. Even through these tribulations, the peasants' resolve remains steadfast and insatiable. For an additional 2 days, the intrepid band wearily pulls and tears their way up the great mountains of the north. They traverse the jagged, rocky terrain without a single complaint or disgruntled murmur. A scout who was deployed earlier in the day returns to the men at dusk. His eyes are wide, and his jaw lies agape. He says nothing to the men as he slowly trudges through the camp. The men stand silent and curious as the scout quietly convenes in a tent with Zoricus and Fenrir. At once, Zoricus bursts from the tent, raises his arms, and blows his horn, commanding the men to quickly prepare for a sudden departure. Only mere moments pass before the men once more stand at attention, silent, with their eyes fixated on Fenrir. Gazing up the mountain, he grasps his scythe and takes his first step. The men roar, beating their chests, raising their weapons and torches into the air as they march forward, following him into the night. An hour passes by on this bleak, frozen night like a black, horned tortoise. All but a few torches have been snuffed out by the cold night's breath. The men march on silently, attempting to match Vendrell and Zoricus' determined pace. A haunting alarm sounds from on high, and the ground trembles in accordance. A foreign, sickening tone frightens the small army to their core, awakening their darkest fears and curiosities. The men stiffen, and their eyes dart back and forth into the darkness, alert and mortified. Zoricus raises his torch, and the men regain confidence, and their silent devotion. Vendrell stares at his men briefly, then once more turns toward the darkness, pressing onward. After a few more intense and uneasy minutes, the men finally reach the summit, their destination at the peak of the mountain, a large cave surrounded by a precipitous, rocky cliff. Awestruck, the men congregate in the presence of the enormous mouth of the cave, looming in the mist and the soft glow of the moon. Two gargantuan demonic statues stand guard at the threshold of this pitch cathedral. Between them, carved deeply in the petrified terrain, is a legion of pagan scriptures and symbols. As the men stand in total bewilderment, not a single word is spoken, until a group of about 10 men express their fears to one another, and in turn, attempt to sway the rest of the militia to retreat with them and avoid their certain demise. Vendrell and Zoricus stand silent and still, saying nothing, as the men loudly deliberate and curse amongst themselves. The small group of 10 cowardly peasants collect their belongings and abandon their comrades. None of the others are swayed. As the tension subsides, Zoricus and Vendrell turn their attention to their remaining brothers in arms. Vendrell does not condemn the men who left, but instead lifts them up, praising their courage thus far. He bids them safe travel for the trek back to their families in the village, as Zoricus whispers a prayer into the air, blessing them, and asking the Lord to shield them with his divine favor. Vendrell calmly addresses the remaining soldiers and gives them one last chance to turn back to the village. Pointing to the large demonic statues guarding the cave, he expresses his just fears of the unknown beyond this point. Lastly, he reluctantly admits to his brethren that he cannot guarantee their safety or well-being, and that whoever turns back now will go with their honor intact and with the blessing of the Lord. Randall turns his back to them, and the men look around at one another, then back toward Vendrell. Not one more step is taken down the mountain. Randall turns back to his brothers, and upon discovering that none have departed, he nods with thanks and approval to the remaining 38 soldiers, and turns to Zoricus for guidance on how to proceed. As they converse, an impatient soldier shoves his way through the crowd and heads towards the statues. 1, 2, 3 steps in, and he stops. One man shouts at him in laughter, "Well, what are you waiting for? Has your lion's heart turned into that of a cub?" The men roar with laughter, and then the soldier drops his weapon. The men fall silent once more. Slowly, the man raises his hands and places them on his throat as he turns back towards the other soldiers. His face is bloated and discolored. He drops to his knees, and his eyes bulge in their sockets. The men silently gasp as they watch this man open his mouth, as if trying to say something. Not one syllable spills from his lips. In their place, a parade of spiders pour from his mouth, and he drops face first into the bloodied soil. The men push back in terror. The tall priest shouts at them with a thunderous voice, and the men turn their attention to him. He then pauses, closes his eyes, and slowly walks into the crowd. Everyone silently observes and makes way for him as he parts through them. Zoricus kneels down, places his hands onto the bare earth, and faces the starlit skies. His fingers dig deep into the earth and grasp 2 fistfuls of dust and soil. His eyes remain clenched shut as he stands up and walks back through the men towards the mouth of the cave. He whispers a prayer in the Latin tongue, Solui conductus, and hurls the dust over the pagan carvings that lie on the ground between the demonic stone guardians. The ground trembles and groans when suddenly a mystic light glows from the deeply carved symbols. Zoricus strikes the ground with his staff, and the glow fades into the dust from whence it came. He turns to Fendrel, and with a single nod, they both pass through the darkness unharmed. The peasants turn to one another in awe and confusion, then cautiously follow their chosen leaders. Once the last man has passed through the threshold, the mountain shakes. It shakes so violently that an avalanche of stone and dirt fall from above, blocking the entrance to the cave, sealing the small army inside. There can be no turning back. There is but one way to go, forward into the foreboding unknown. Act 4, The Gatekeeper. The soldiers gasp and cover their faces as the dust settles inside the stoned tomb. Every torch is snuffed out by the sheer force of air from the avalanche. The men are paralyzed with fear as the blackness surrounds them. Hushed whispers pass from one man to the next as a mix of fearful expression and brotherly assurance echo through the black chamber. One voice silences the rest. Fendrel's deep, gravelly voice hushes his disoriented brethren. Once the cavern's walls feel the last panic-stricken reverberation, Fendrel quietly confers with Zoricus. Hesitantly, the priest reaches into the depths of his large leather satchel and produces a sizable crystal orb. In the pitch darkness, he is heard once more whispering in Latin, Ignium. To the wonderment of all gathered, a pale, dim light begins to resonate and hum from within the center of the ornamental stone. The light grows brighter as his voice grows louder in unison, until the brilliance fills the bleak, icy sanctuary. Not one soul in this place stands unamazed. Even Fendrel's eyes widen with surprise as he witnesses the pure power of the Lord. Eyes dart to and fro between the men and back to Zoricus' marvelous display. Fendrel reaches out and touches the orb that his friend is holding, and from the depths of his belly, he begins to chuckle at the miracle. Breaking the silence with his infectious laugh, the men follow suit, roaring with boisterous howls of laughter and relief. The snickering continues, even as the men press on, deeper into the abyss. For some time, the army slowly moves as one tightly knit unit, until coming to an immediate halt, as a shocking sound rattles their spirits to the core, the bone-chilling sound of the hopeless shriek when a man plunges off a cliff, headlong into a newly discovered gorge. The men smash into one another, retreating from the supposed edge of the cliffside as the priest makes his way through the commotion. Upon discovering the great infinite void, he too is frightened, but soon regains his composure. Clearing his throat, Zoricus shouts at the top of his lungs at his shaken companions. At once, he thrusts his hand into the air, wielding the crystal orb with purpose. His eyes once more clench tight as he bellows unto the Creator, Solis Eterna. A mystic wind rushes all around them as the orb glows brighter and more luminous. Zoricus repeats his plea over and over again as the light flourishes and his voice booms louder and more harsh. His eyelids burst open and beam with the light of the sun itself. Some of the men shriek and cover their eyes as the shadows wither in retreat. revealing an enormous drawbridge on the far opposite side of the great chasm. The priest drops the bright orb and falls to his knees. His eyes shut, his back bends, and his forehead lowers, resting on the dust-covered earth. Fendrel breaks through the mass of awestruck men and grips his friend's arm, helping him to his feet. The men are terrified, both by the bewildering otherworldly display and the revelation of a colossal drawbridge. As Zoricus wipes the dirt from his clothes and regains composure, numerous whispers of chatter and confusion abound. Fendrel grasps the bright orb from the ground and holds it above his head, illuminating the drawbridge once more. The priest squints and stares across the vast canyon, fixing his gaze upon the bridge's pagan carvings, of which it is so abundantly adorned. After deciphering the symbols, he turns around, scans the crowd, then points directly at a specific man wielding a spear, beckoning him to the front of the group. Zoricus promptly snatches the spear from his grasp and inspects the sharp iron tip. He walks 20 paces through the crowd, forcing the soldiers apart. Without warning, he twists around and sprints 10 long, calculated strides and skids to a halt, launching the spear into the air with impressive force and heavenly precision. The peasant spearman gasps as his only weapon soars through the muggy air, finding a final resting place lodged perfectly in the large wooden plank. Zoricus remains frozen in the position in which he landed, staring across the way as the spear vibrates in the grain. The man from whom the spear was borrowed covers his eyes with his hands and curses under his breath. At once, all the other soldiers burst out in a nervous laughter that momentarily replaces their fears with confusion. The former spearman marches over to Zoricus, and just as he begins to, shall we say, express his displeasure in the matter, Zoricus places his hand over the man's mouth, shushing him, his eyes still fixed upon the large wooden door. The spearman turns his head, followed by his eyes, redirecting his gaze. The giant wooden behemoth stands, silent and unmoved. Embarrassed, and now slightly annoyed, the spearman shoves the priest's hand off his mouth and barks in protest, but is interrupted by an earth-shaking sound. The men fall silent and raise their cloddish shields as rubble cascades down the stony walls. This world under the mountain moans and groans and trembles as the humongous drawbridge creaks and cracks. Steamy fog pours from behind the plank as it slowly and loudly lowers, accompanied by the deafening sounds of gigantic steel chains and sprockets. The drawbridge nearly crushes 7 men, who, at the last moment, leap from its path as it finally comes to rest on the plain where they once stood. As the steam and dust clear, the men once again erupt in laughter at the hilarity of the situation. Fendrel and Zoricus raise their arms and the men fall silent. "Who among you are brave enough and willing to cross the bridge and report back?" Fendrel asks. None step forward. The gravity of the scene is obvious and justified. The tall priest turns toward the gargantuan wooden plank and, without one word, takes his first step. 1, 2, 3, 4. As he takes the 5th step, he feels a hand touch his shoulder. Zoricus turns to find the spearman standing behind him, with a look of resolve on his face. The 2 men nod to one another. The priest turns back and takes his place next to Fendrel once more. The soldiers stare intently at the brave spearman as he slowly and carefully moves across the drawbridge, further and further across the canyon, and into the unknown blackness. As he treks onward, his incendiary torchlight beams and then dims into the feeble flicker glow of a candle, and then nothing. Minutes go by as the army eagerly awaits news from their scout. Then hours pass. The soldiers grow more and more anxious and fearful of what lies ahead. Suddenly, a shout rings out. "I say a light!" The men squint and peer into the darkness until they too see the glow of their scout's torch. Relief finds them, and Fendrel beckons to the scout by waving his torch above his head with broad strokes. The scout shouts back to the men.
"Brothers, it's sick."
His words are cut short mid-sentence. The men look around at one another, confused and perplexed. Fendrel lifts his torch above his head and takes 4 steps forward onto the bridge, then pauses and turns back to his infantry. Just as confused as the rest of the men, Fendrel turns back toward the darkness and exhales. Out of the silentious abyss, a bone-chilling shriek ricochets from every hard gray surface and echoes throughout the skull of every man. Then it stops. A dim light appears and grows brighter, hurling through the entrance of the drawbridge, bouncing and skidding across the heavy plank, like a not-so-smooth stone bumbling atop the surface of a placid lake. The men dart, clearing away from the object's path as it slides to a stop. One man slowly makes his way toward the luminescent mass. Upon closer inspection, it is discovered to be the remains of the fearless ex-spearman. To his horror, the man has been torn in twain, and his still-burning torch is sunk deeply into his chest. The soldier is taken aback and speechless. He turns toward the company, sputtering gibberish as he points to his flaming companion. A loud voice resounds with inquiry from within the group.
"What is it?"
asks Fendrel. Quaking in fear, the young soldier says nothing. His arm slowly raises, shaking like a leaf in a snowstorm, and he points toward the gate, his eyes wide and his mouth agape.
"Well,"
Fendel's cry is cut short by an earth-shaking roar, and the cavern trembles. The ground beneath their very feet rumbles, and dust rains on their heads. And then, what can only be described as a giant, grotesque, troll-like creature bursts through the thick haze, lumbering across the bridge with tremendous speed towards the men. Its eyes are black as char. Its mouth grinds with froth and foam, like a rabid, starving beast, as it charges nearer and nearer. Zoricus commands his fellow soldiers to hold their ground and prepare for attack. Some of the men shriek in fear, drop their weapons, and retreat. Others charge toward the great behemoth with justified fear and righteous fury. The beast and soldiers clash and cloud an ocean of blood. Torches blaze and pitchforks sink into its flesh. The sharp edge of Fendrel's scythe cuts and shreds the breast and throat of the beast, but nothing can stop its wrath as it rips men in half with a single pull. Zoricus leaps onto its large fur-covered back and plunges his staff into its skull. The giant beast rears. It howls and grips Zoricus in its claws, and its mouth opens wide as it screeches into his face. Just as the hellish creature is about to place Zoricus in its mighty jaws, a blacksmith's hammer whirls through the air and smashes into its temple, causing its grip to loosen. Fendrel grasps the ankle of Zoricus and rips him from the mighty clenched fist. The 2 men fall to the dusty ground and scramble to safety behind a large wet stalagmite. As the chaotic battle winds down, Zoricus observes that the drawbridge is no longer guarded and motions to Fendrel that they should make their escape.
"Go, I'll be right behind you,"
Fendrel orders as he turns back to the bloody scene in search of his weapon. The atmosphere is damp and warm with the copper scent of freshly spilled blood. The beast has devoured the militia, and only a few men remain in the fight against the giant guardian. Either by odd luck or blessed fortune, Fendrel spots his scythe and makes his move, darting into the mass of shredded flesh and mangled bone. Just as he grasps his scythe and turns back towards the drawbridge, he hears the familiar hushed whisper of his name. He turns to find the town blacksmith on the ground, his legs pinned under a pile of his fallen brethren. The beast sits mere feet away, distracted, with a corpse in each hand. Fenril offers the handle of his weapon to the blacksmith, who holds tight as the farmer pulls him to safety through the river of blood and filth. The two men join Zoricus on the large bridge and quickly make their way across the gorge. Once they reach the safety of the other side, the blacksmith reaches up and pulls a large, rusty iron lever. The bridge moans, and the chains tighten and clank together. The beast hears this and twists round toward the men, dropping his meal to the ground and stumbling to its feet. The drawbridge is slow and is not going to close in time to separate the men from the monster. Zoricus is quick to react. He falls to his knees at the foot of the bridge and places his hands on the wooden structure.
Zoricus, hurry. It's coming.
Fenril begs. Zoricus lifts his head, and his eyes burst open and shine once more with a white light. At once, the voices of 10 men boom from his lips, and the drawbridge flies up, causing the beastly guardian to stumble and slide off the edge of the bridge. Its claws tear into the wood, but do not stop its descent as it plunges into the deep, black abyss. The bridge slams into place, and the 3 men slump to the ground, exhausted. Act 5, The Descent into Madness. The bridge has been drawn. Chains still sway to and fro, singing together in an eerie, hellish chorus. The 3 men lie weak and wounded in the pitch darkness. The blacksmith clutches his wounded leg and feverishly binds it with a leather belt, hoping to staunch the flow of blood. Fenril strikes his scythe against a stone as Zoricus holds a small pile of roots and sticks together, blowing gently to swoon a spark. Fire catches, and the 3 men scrounge for burnable substances to heap onto the flames. The yellow and orange light from the young fire glows, exposing the large black walls of the cave. The smell is putrid and nauseating. The moist brown air reeks with the stench of death and decay. Countless piles of bones, in the crude form of pyramids, stand tall and mighty, warning all who enter this dismal place that they do not belong in this black temple. The men light their torches, further illuminating the chamber. Foreign pagan carvings and blood art smear the walls, promising death and annihilation. Fenril and Zoricus each take hold of one of the wounded blacksmith's arms, and together they hobble, delving deeper into the gullet of the mountain. Shortly, the men stumble upon another tunnel. This one is different, as its entrance is very small, almost hidden, almost as if it were a doorway to a secret passage. The men spend the next few moments with their torches raised, searching for any other passageways or tunnels. Zoricus holds his torch closely to the wall, studying the etchings, hoping to decipher some sort of helpful hint or sense of direction. No fortune finds them. The men stall for a few minutes more, deliberating their next move, and who should be the first to lead the furthering expedition. The blacksmith groans and swipes the torch from Zoricus, and using his hammer as a crutch, slowly drops to his knees. The blacksmith throws his torch into the black tunnel. The light from the torch reveals a smaller room and a staircase. The blacksmith slowly crawls into the space. Once through, he picks up the dwindling torch and blows on it, bringing it back to life.
Well, what are you waiting for?
He beckons to the 2 other men. Fendrel turns around and waves his torch about, standing guard while Zoricus makes safe passage through the tiny opening. Once inside, he beckons his friend to follow. Torches in hand, the men observe their surroundings as the blacksmith starts down the coarse, jagged steps. They follow with great caution and alertness. This staircase is different than the last. It seems to be one long, unwinding, narrow path. On the right side, it is a cold, frigid mountain wall. To the left lies yet another immeasurable canyon of bleak emptiness. The men traverse slowly and deliberately downward, in single file. The stairs seem endless. Each step of icy stone is more jagged than the last. There is no end in sight. Suddenly, something ominous catches Zoricus's eye. More pagan carvings adorn the wall. Fendrel and the blacksmith carry on, as Zoricus stops to translate the dark language. With a cry, Zoricus turns to the men who are now several paces away and screams for them to stop. Fendrel hears his cry and turns around, looking up the stairs toward his friend. However, the blacksmith does not seem to hear the cry of warning. He takes 2 more steps, when suddenly 4 tall, honed wooden spikes thrust upward from the stony path, impaling his body and carrying him 20 feet high. Both companions cry out in anguish, and their voices echo piercingly throughout the cave. Fendrel reacts quickly, looking for any way to pull the spikes down to save his companion, but to no avail. For a long moment, the wooden beams rattle and tremble as the blacksmith whimpers and writhes, choking and coughing on copious amounts of his own blood before he quickly and violently dies in a shaking struggle. His body falls limp and creeps slowly down the wooden spikes with a dreadful slurp. Fendrel cries out to the Lord, placing his forehead on one of the deathly beams. The warm blood and entrails pour over his head as steam rises from the abyss, anointing him. Zoricus joins his brother at the foot of the spikes, pulling Fendrel away from the grisly contraption. Standing back, the 2 men behold the gruesome scene, now more aware than ever of their perilous environs. Fendrel sits hunched on the steps, with his face buried deep into his hands. Zoricus stands at the foot of the trap, praying quietly and dripping holy water from a tiny glass vial onto the blood-stained wooden pikes, blessing their fallen comrade. Proceeding with caution, the 2 friends shimmy around the spikes and slowly advance downward. Fendrel leads the way, his humble torch crackling in the air as he waves it all around in search of other carvings or warnings for Zoricus to translate. The walls are barren, but look! The last step is finally in view! The light from Fendrel's torch illuminates a tunnel at the foot of the stairs, and the men fix their eyes upon it. Fendrel readies his scythe in a combatant stance, for on this long journey, they have come to expect the dreadfully unexpected. The men move in tandem. Step after deliberate step, they move downward towards the landing. As they approach the tunnel, Zoricus notices a pagan carving on the wall out of the corner of his eye, and, without a word, quickly shoves Fendrel out of the way. Both men tumble to the cold, grimy ground with a loud crash. Holding their breath, they wait for the presumed ambush or whatever repercussions are to befall them. The only sound is the dripping of water and the crackling of flame. Both men lie motionless, and apprehension fills the air. Minutes pass. Drip, 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 and nothing. The 2 slowly and cautiously rise to their feet. Fendrel bends over and grasps his scythe as Zoricus wipes mud and small debris off of his cloak. Both men begin to nervously, quietly laugh as they simultaneously realize the consequences of their actions. Zoricus takes the torch from Fenrir's hand and turns to make his way toward the tunnel, when a swift scratching noise rings through the darkness. He drops the torch and stands completely still and rigid.
Zoricus, what is it? What do you see?
Fenrir whispers. He takes 3 steps forward and picks up the fallen torch. He raises it high and peers past Zoricus into the hazy darkness, resting his hand on his friend's shoulder.
Zoricus.
Suddenly, Zoricus' head swivels and topples right off of his body, hitting the ground with a bone-chilling thud. Fenrir lets the torch fall and sags back onto the stone-carved stairs in horror. His body becomes limp and weak with shock and sadness. He collapses onto the jagged terrain and slumps forward until his face is all but buried in the mud and muck of the moist cavern floor. He weeps, his arms spread wide, and his fingers dig into the black earth, forming clenched fists of filth. Rolling to his side, his cries start from wall to wall, echoing in a chorus of kindred agony. Fenrir pours out his sadness for his fallen brother until his soul's wellspring runs dry. Finally, after what seems like 1,000 agonizing moments, his eyes open and his muddy face loses all expression. He rises to his knees and clambers toward the lifeless body before him. Delicately removing Zoricus' leather satchel from his corpse, he places it around his neck. Now he is alone. Taking hold once more of his scythe and torch, Fenrir pulls himself to his feet and takes a deep breath. Directly before him stands a crude and decrepit wooden contraption, tucked betwixt the shadows. Ancient rusted chains, threadbare rope pulleys, and 2 large, time-worn leather belts adorn a crude, hulking wooden box. He has never seen such an invention before. With no other path in sight, he slowly and cautiously steps inside the flimsy, wobbly device as a large gate creaks shut behind him, latching and locking him in. Now what? He grumbles to himself under his breath. Raising his torch, he inspects every crevice of this wooden rig. Growing more and more impatient, Fenrir raps the butt of his scythe against the floor. Suddenly, the large machine rattles, and the chains clatter together in unison. The ropes begin to move slowly on their fixed pulleys, lowering the chamber into the abysmal unknown. Fenrir steels himself to prepare for whatever is to come. Water drips and his ears ache as the contraption descends lower and lower. The deeper he goes, the colder it gets. Water evolves into ice before his eyes, and his breath becomes visible. His skin cracks and his muscles tighten. The chamber finally halts after several agonizingly long minutes, and he tightens the grip on his scythe in anticipation. The door latch releases and the gate swings wide. His eyes have now adjusted to the lack of light in this place and become sensitive and keen. As he steps out of the elevator, he is startled by a blue haze coming from the end of a seemingly endless tunnel. The blue light is enough to help him navigate through the darkness. He turns to the wall and snuffs out his torch. Act 6, Blue Haze, Red Blood. Something is different about this place. The ground and tunnel walls vibrate and tremble in tandem. Fenrir drops to his knees, purging the last meal he was afforded, as a dreadful hum shakes every cell and fiber in his body. As his knees buckle and he kneels down onto the icy rubble, he gasps and heaves, clutching his chest. Frigid sweat drips from the edges of his beard. Still, the hum continues. And then something happens. Fendrel hears the faint sound of a small girl. Could it be? Is the devil playing tricks on his exhausted, fragmented mind? His head snaps forward and his eyes burst open, penetrating through the thick miasma. Peering down the murky tunnel, his ears come alive, welcoming the noise once more. The hum grows stronger. Fendrel's hands dig deep and claw at the hardened earth. His body shakes as he takes hold of the long wooden handle of his weapon. His scythe rattles and wanders over the petrified ground as he hoists himself to his feet once more. He focuses and meditates, catching his breath and stabilizing his trembling body as best he can. Taking one step closer to the blue light, he hears the same cry that he had heard before. Every father knows the cry of his own child, and up until this very moment, Fendrel did not know whether he would see the porcelain face of his only daughter ever again. He is renewed and determined. Adrenaline pumps through his veins, and his feet are quick. It is as he nears the end of the tunnel that our dear Fendrel remembers the dangerous nature of his quest. Suddenly, the air begins to choke his breath, and once more seizes his body. He crashes to the ground, and writhing on his back, he grips his jaw and pries it open, desperately pleading the thick, toxic air for any oxygen or life it has to offer. Fenrir's eyes cinch tightly. He is on the brink of unconsciousness when a bright apparition jolts him to the present. He sees her, Isabella, crying and reaching out desperately for her father to save her. He lunges to his feet and stomps through the muck, finally reaching the end of the black, noxious tunnel. As quietly as he can, Fendrel inches toward the threshold. His hands hug the frozen wall of the tunnel as he holds his breath, peering around the corner. Blue light edges over his forehead and burns his now watering eyes. He has grown so accustomed to this dark hellscape that his eyes take several lengthy moments to acclimate to even the dimmest effulgence. Trembling fingers clumsily wipe away tears from his eyes and smear black soil over his wearied face. The farmer's tears run dry, and his eyes regain focus as he grasps his weapon, turning the corner to a ghastly, abominable sight. He has entered a new realm of terror and fright.
Is this hell?
Giant, blue-flamed torches adorn the endless gargantuan stone walls. Haunting, high-pitched screams reverberate throughout this tomb, muffled only by the deafening, paralyzing hum that swarms within his skull. Fendrel's heart pounds, almost bursting from his chest when he hears the distant cry of his daughter echo through the grim, tremendous Colosseum. He can barely contain his excitement as he whispers to himself, "She's alive." A tidal wave of relief washes over him, crashing against the great beach of horror. Hope rushes through his veins, even in this, his darkest of hours. Step after step, Fendrel's tattered boots crunch as he trespasses over this frozen wasteland. The ground beneath his feet is littered with fragments of bone and rotted flesh. The flames burn brighter and brighter, illuminating unimaginable horror never before conceived by man. At the opposite end of this baneful temple, Fendrel's darkest nightmares are realized. Sitting on an enormous, crude throne carved from ice and stone sits a putrescent, monstrous being, thrice the size of any mortal man, gilded by unholy darkness and cloaked in perversion. This mountain of a man is covered in black, jagged armor. On his head rests a warrior's crown, forged of white human bone, from 1,000 men. His breath boils and barrels forth like steam from a geyser through his fanged teeth. Clawed gauntlets rest on the arms of his throne. Silent and still, he waits. Closer and closer, Randall draws nearer. His pace quickens. Beside the throne sits a large altar made of stone, wood, and much rope. On display in the center of the altar lies Isabella, her legs and arms spread wide over the stone device. Her wrists bleed and ache from the tight, sharp rope that binds her. Her screams and cries shred through the haze like a Fletcher's arrow. For days, she has come to know the depths of immeasurable despair. As the father draws nearer to his beloved daughter, his pulse pounds and his breath falls short. The sound of her father's approaching footsteps seemed to be a mirage at first, and easily dismissible by such a tortured spirit as hers. These footsteps are unlike the ones she has heard in this place. They do not cease, but in fact grow louder and more defined. Her head snaps toward the darkness, and her swollen eyes peer into the dark asylum. It cannot be. Her father, her savior. Hope had abandoned her soul long ago, and yet, here he was. After all the pain and suffering, a spark of hope has been reignited. A smile beams from her tormented face. Randall cannot contain himself. Tears stream from his eyes, and the lump in his throat explodes with a booming declaration as he shouts,
My daughter, I am here.
The excitement is short-lived. Standing to his feet, the beast man grunts and roars with laughter. Clutching a brutish, gnarled mace, he heaves it with intense force, chopping and severing a thick rope to the side of his throne. The rope snaps and whips upward into the black air, and suddenly, a massive steel-wrought gate plummets from the smoky atmosphere above Randall, trapping him like a caged animal, separating him from his daughter. Randall slams into the frozen metal barrier and falls to his knees. No! He bellows. The demon booms with laughter and the walls shake. Randall's daughter twists toward the armored hellion, pleading with indecipherable cries. Scoffing at the girl and her hero, the beast slumps back onto his throne of ice and stone. The farmer grips the freezing metal, and his skin burns and cracks. He falls back and grips his wrist as his knuckles seize and lock, and his hand shrivels before his very eyes into bone. Despair once more befalls him. Randall rises to his feet and begins to pace back and forth, examining the device for any weak point or large enough opening to break through. The girl begins to whimper and moan with defeat once more. The demon stands and slowly marches toward his captured prey. In a foreign tongue, the hellspawn mocks and torments the distraught father. Randall cries and pleads with the tormentor. The villain raises his arm and draws it slowly over the bars. Clink, 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 and slugs off, snickering with laughter. Randall scans the frozen steel gate once more and finds that it is impenetrable. The monster sags into his throne once more and falls silent. Randall's arm throbs and his body is weak, but the most torturous facet he must endure is the sound of his beloved daughter in such pain and anguish. But the farmer cannot give up. Has he come so far to get so close and fail? Is this it? The end? No, it shall not be. He stews and schemes. What would Zorgus do? He thinks to himself. Just then, he looks to the ground and notices his friend's leather satchel laying at his feet. Reaching into the dark pocket, he grasps the large glass orb his friend once employed. The farmer has witnessed such power and energy from this curious object, but does not know the extent of its power or how to wield it. Fendrel takes 2 steps back and extends his arm, gripping the orb tightly in his sweaty palm, revealing it to the monster. The demon shrieks loudly and recoils, hissing with detest. The walls tremble and steam arises from the depths. Fendrel cries to the Lord, repeating the only Latin prayer he has ever known, one that he had learned when he was a child. Tears stream from his face as he remembers his mother repeating it to him when he was laid to rest each night. Giving thanks and asking for protection, he places his faith in the all-powerful Creator, begging for mercy in his time of need. The beast's bark and roar gets louder and louder. Hissing and snarling, the cloaked giant turns and crawls towards his writhing victim, gnashing his teeth. Suddenly, Fendrel's eyes beam with a ferocious, blinding white light, and he bellows at the beast, hurling the orb at the steel contraption. Upon impact, the orb shatters, melting the large steel frame and causing the cave to quake and collapse around them. Ice and stone tumble all around them, and the dusty, toxic air thickens to a putrid smog, smothering everything in its wake. Minutes pass as man and beast stand still, waiting the end of the turbulence. As the last pebble falls, everything stops. Only silence consumes the air. Out from the dust, the giant black warrior leaps through the haze, pinning the farmer to the ground. Fendrel's small dagger pierces through the belly of the beast, and the demon howls. Isabella shrieks as the farmer squirms from the monster's deathly grip and scrambles to his feet. The air is thick and dark. Fendrel drops to his hands and knees and scans the icy floor for his scythe. The demon growls and paces through the mist, searching for the farmer. Fendrel stands up and beckons loudly to the beast. The black giant turns around just as the farmer delivers a heavy blow to his head, relieving him of his crown of bones. The demon collapses into the mist, lying silent, still, and vulnerable. Now is the time for Fendrel to make his kill. The weary farmer draws nearer to the villain, tightening the grip on his scythe. Raising it in the air, he is struck by a shocking display. Half of the creature's face is that of an infant child. Soft, pure, and pink-skinned, the gruff farmer is stunned as pastel blue eyes gaze into his own. Fendrel's arm lowers onto his side, and in this shocking moment of discovery, the demon lunges forward, plunging his large, clawed, armored fist into his gut. Isabella screams in terror as the beast forcefully rends his fist from her father's abdomen. Fendrel cries out in agony and drops his scythe as he falls to the frozen earth, grasping frantically at his gushing, gaping wound. He falls to his knees. Sweat and tears pour from his face as he cranes his neck toward his helpless daughter.
"I'm sorry, my dear,"
he murmurs. The giant stands up, replacing his crown as he slithers toward the altar. Fendrel's face turns as pale as a fresh winter snow as he watches the beast slug towards his precious Isabella. Placing Fendrel's very own dagger on the soft ivory skin of her neck, the monster slowly turns to face her father. The warrior lets out a blood-curdling plea as he grasps his scythe and drags himself to his feet. "No!" Without a single ounce of mercy, the devil slowly draws Fendrel's knife edge across her scrawny neck. Her eyes widen in shock and fear as her pupils dilate. Fendrel wails and stretches his arm toward the nightmarish scene as the last spark of life flees his daughter's body. Utterly devastated, The farmer drops to his knees, accepting defeat. The earth still trembles, and as the dull hum crescendos into a choir of agony, the black giant strides toward the farmer and tosses his weapon aside. With one arm, the beast clutches Fendral's neck, pulling him to his feet and lifting him off the ground. The humble farmer dangles as his warm blood trickles off of his boots, puddling onto the ground below him. The giant demon rests the farmer's forehead on his own, peering into the hopeless eyes of this broken mortal man. His hot breath reeks and spills from his mask as his laughter resonates through the cave. All of Fendral's memories come flooding back in these, his final moments of life. His childhood with Zorkus, the soft lips of his wife, the first time he laid eyes on his daughter and heard her infant cries. All of these memories inspire his senses to act in a peculiar manner. This broken man is overcome with a quiet laughter. The laughter grows louder and stronger. Suddenly, Fendral's eyes burst with white light, and he fixes his gaze on the devil before him. Raising his right arm, scythe in hand, the farmer once more relays the monster of his crown, and his head with it. The cloaked giant releases Fendral and careens into the rubble below. Fendral falls to the rocky terrain as his eyes stop glowing. Placing his blood-stained hands over his face, he attempts to weep, but discovers he has no more tears to shed. Dropping his hands to his side, his face bears no expression. The earth groans, and the hum becomes deafening. The farmer lifts his head to the heavens and prays. However, it is not a prayer of love. It is a prayer of something else, something deep and dark, something that consumes what remains of his shattered soul. His eyes become black. Reaching down, he picks up the crown of bones from the defeated beast and places it on his own hand. Standing to his feet, he hobbles to the great AC throne and sits at that helm of darkness. A smile forms on his lips as his right hand grips the wooden handle of his bloodied scythe. The choirs of hell rejoice. Death is born.
You've been listening to The Origin, written by Randall J. Bell and Gabriel Burkum. Read by Randall J. Bell. This program is copyright 2018 by Randall J. Bell.